By 1943, the air war over Europe had transformed into a brutal contest of endurance and engineering. Germany's Luftwaffe, once the pride of Europe, was being stretched to its breaking point. The early triumphs of 1939 and 1940, when Messerschmitts and Stukas ruled the sky, had faded into memory. Now Allied bombers came daily, endless formations of flying fortresses and liberators, droning eastward like a metallic tide. The Reich's cities, its factories, its oil refineries, all were under siege from the air. The Luftwaffe scrambled to intercept, but the cost was crippling. The veteran pilots who once carried the Luftwaffe's legend were gone, lost in the attrition of Russia and the Mediterranean. Their replacements were younger, less trained, and flying aircraft that could no longer keep pace with the evolving war. And then came the escorts. At first, the Germans believed they could hold the line. American bombers flying from England were fast, well-armed, but, in theory, vulnerable once they outflew their fighter cover. The Luftwaffe planned to strike them deep over Germany, where no Allied fighter could reach. That plan worked for a time, but in early 1943 the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt entered combat, and the balance began to shift. It was unlike anything the Germans had expected. Built by Republic Aviation in Farmingdale, New York, the P-47 was a machine of raw muscle, massive, almost ungainly in size. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, a 2,000 horsepower radial monster, was coupled with a complex turbo-supercharger system that gave it unmatched performance at high altitude. Where other fighters were lean and graceful, the Thunderbolt was heavy and brutal. But that bulk concealed a purpose: armor plates that could shrug off cannon fire, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a massive frame that could dive at speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour without tearing apart. To American pilots, it became affectionately known as the Jug, a nod to its thick, bottle-like fuselage. To the Luftwaffe, it soon became something else entirely: a nightmare. By the summer of 1943, the P-47 was flying with the 8th Air Force over Western Europe. It escorted bombers as far as its fuel would allow, cutting through enemy interceptors with .850 caliber machine guns, the heaviest armament ever mounted on a single-seat Allied fighter. The Germans at first mocked it. A bomber pretending to be a fighter, they called it. But the mockery vanished quickly. The Thunderbolt climbed higher than the Bf-109, dove faster than the FW-190, and could take punishment that would have shredded any German airframe. Luftwaffe pilots began reporting duels where their cannon shells simply failed to bring the American down. Others described the frustration of seeing a Thunderbolt escape vertically, diving into a controlled fall from which no Messerschmitt could follow. Still, German engineers could not believe such an aircraft could even fly efficiently. To them, every kilogram mattered. German design philosophy favored light, aerodynamic elegance, machines like the Bf-109 or FW-190 that relied on agility and precision. The Thunderbolt defied every law they believed in, yet by late 1943, it was changing the air war's rhythm. As bomber formations pushed deeper into the Reich, the P-47s tore through German interceptors, returning again and again even after taking brutal damage. Each encounter left German intelligence officers puzzled. How could an aircraft so large be so fast, so resilient, so deadly? The answer would only come later, when one of those massive jugs fell not in flames, but intact behind German lines, and when it did, the Luftwaffe's engineers would finally see what they were truly up against. For the Luftwaffe, the year 1944 opened under darkening skies. The Reich was burning from above, and the once invincible German fighter arm was now locked in a defensive war it could no longer win. In those desperate months, the Luftwaffe's intelligence division, known as Oberkommando der Luftwaffe, OKL, became increasingly obsessed with understanding what made Allied aircraft so formidable. Each crash site became a potential goldmine of information, a chance to recover engines, instruments, or armament that might reveal the enemy's technological edge. By this time, German engineers had already studied several captured aircraft: the British Spitfire, the American P-38 Lightning, and the early P-51 Mustang. Each was impressive in its own right, but all still followed the traditional design philosophies Germany understood well: inline engines, streamlined frames, and lightweight structures built for maneuverability. Then came the Thunderbolt, the first relatively intact P-47 to fall into German hands came after a forced landing in occupied France in late 1943. It had been crippled by flak during a bomber escort mission but had not exploded or burned. Its pilot, bleeding but alive, was taken prisoner. His aircraft quickly surrounded by Wehrmacht troops who, at first, were astonished by its size. The wreck was shipped under heavy guard to Recklinlerz airfield, Germany's most secretive testing facility. This was the Luftwaffe's equivalent of the Allied Farnborough or Wright Field, a sprawling base where captured aircraft were disassembled, examined and sometimes flown by elite test pilots to gather data. At Rechlin, engineers from Messerschmitt, Focke-Wulf, Junkers, and the Luftwaffe's technical office gathered to study the American machine. When the Thunderbolt's outer panels were removed, what they found challenged everything they thought they knew about airframe design. The fuselage was built with exceptional strength, not through light alloys or exotic materials, but through sheer industrial consistency. The internal wiring was abundant, neatly organized and marked in English, with redundancy systems in case of damage. Even the cockpit astonished them, rugged, spacious, and dominated by an array of instruments for engine management, altitude, and radio communication far beyond anything found in German fighters. But it was the engine that drew the most awe. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a 2,804 cubic inch 18-cylinder radial engine, sat like a steel heart at the front of the aircraft, connected through a complex ducting system to a General Electric turbo-supercharger mounted in the rear fuselage. It was capable of maintaining full power even at 30,000 feet. German aircraft had superchargers, but none like this. They marveled at its simplicity of maintenance and ruggedness. The engine could keep running even after losing cylinders, something almost unthinkable for the fragile inline Daimler-Benz or Junkers Jumo engines used in German fighters. Reports from Rechlin engineers described it bluntly. The American machine is built not for performance in peacetime, but for survival in total war. To them, the Thunderbolt reflected something deeper, not just a design difference but a philosophical one. German engineering had been forced by scarcity and precision craftsmanship. American engineering, by contrast, was born from industrial abundance, the ability to build, test, fail, and rebuild in massive numbers. The Luftwaffe's pilots felt that difference in the sky every day. While they flew meticulously tuned aircraft that required delicate handling, American pilots soared in machines that could take bullets through the wings, lose oil pressure, and still make it home. By early 1944, German intelligence had classified the P-47 as a strategic threat, not merely because of its fighting power, but because it proved that Allied industry could produce quality at scale. And soon, that realization would evolve into something more personal, when German test pilots strapped themselves into the captured Thunderbolt, fired up its massive radial engine, and took to the sky. The test reports that followed would astonish even the most hardened Luftwaffe officers. When German engineers and test pilots at Rechlin began studying the captured P-47, they quickly realized that to understand it, they had to abandon nearly every assumption they held about fighter design. The Thunderbolt wasn't a machine of elegance. It was a machine of endurance, power, and survivability. In the center of the hangar, under cold fluorescent lights, the American secret stood revealed: the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. It wasn't simply an engine, it was a mechanical ecosystem. German engineers circled it like archaeologists studying an artifact from another world. The massive radial cylinders, arranged in 2 rows of 9, were cooled by air rather than water, eliminating radiators, coolant lines, and the vulnerability that came with them. To the Germans, who relied heavily on liquid-cooled inline engines like the Daimler-Benz DB605 or Jumo 213, this seemed primitive. Yet when they ran the R2800 on test stands, they were stunned. The engine produced 2,000 horsepower consistently, without overheating. The integration of a turbo-supercharger, mounted far behind the cockpit and linked through long exhaust ducts, maintained sea-level power even at extreme altitudes. This gave the Thunderbolt a critical advantage. It could climb into the rarefied air above 30,000 feet, where most Luftwaffe fighters gasped for oxygen. The engineers noted the efficiency of its cooling, the durability of its components, and the precision of its machining. American manufacturing tolerances were astonishingly uniform. Every bolt, every panel, every tube fit perfectly, interchangeable with any other Thunderbolt built in any other factory. In contrast, German aircraft production by 1944 had become fragmented, inconsistent, and reliant on slave labor. Precision parts often didn't match between plants. At Rechlin, the contrast was humbling. The Thunderbolt's design philosophy became clear. It was not meant to win by elegance, but by outlasting chaos. For Allied pilots, the P-47 was both a blessing and a challenge. It was heavy, nearly twice the weight of the Bf-109. On takeoff, it required a long runway and careful throttle control to avoid torque roll. But once airborne, it became a beast. Its dive was legendary. With the turbo-supercharger keeping its engine breathing, the P-47 could plummet from altitude at over 500 miles per hour, a speed at which most German fighters risked structural failure. Luftwaffe pilots soon learned never to follow a Thunderbolt into a dive. They disappear into the earth, one veteran recalled, and somehow they always pull out. The Jug's 850 caliber Browning M2 machine guns turned the sky into a wall of lead. Each could fire 850 rounds per minute, shredding any aircraft caught in its sights. In head-on engagements, German pilots found themselves outgunned. Their 20mm cannons packed more explosive power, but far fewer rounds. A single Thunderbolt could maintain sustained fire for nearly 30 seconds, an eternity in aerial combat. And then there was its resilience. Pilots recounted returning home with entire cylinders shot out, wings riddled with holes, and control cables half severed, yet still managing to land. The armor plating around the cockpit and engine gave pilots a sense of invincibility unmatched by any other Allied aircraft. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, struggled to adapt. Their lightweight fighters could outturn the P-47, but they couldn't outrun it, couldn't outdive it, and couldn't survive its firepower. Every Thunderbolt loss cost the Allies resources. Every German pilot loss cost the Reich irreplaceable experience. The engineers' reports began reflecting what frontline pilots already knew. The Thunderbolt wasn't designed to win dogfights, and it was designed to win wars of attrition. To understand the Thunderbolt fully, the Germans also had to confront the industrial truth behind it. By 1944, Republic Aviation, aided by subcontractors across America, could produce up to one P-47 every 2 hours. American assembly lines had perfected modular production, engines, wings, fuselages, and weapon systems arriving from different plants to be fitted seamlessly together. German engineers were stunned by the efficiency reports captured from Allied documents. A single P-47 required over 13,000 man-hours to build, but those hours were distributed across a workforce of millions and supported by an industrial base, untouched by bombing. In the Reich, the situation was the opposite. Factories were scattered under constant attack and plagued by shortages. Each aircraft was almost handcrafted, a marvel of engineering but impossible to scale. At Rechlin, one engineer wrote, "Where we build with precision and scarcity, they build with volume and confidence." That confidence was visible in every rivet of the Thunderbolt. Even its landing gear, oversized and rugged, was designed for rough forward airfields, something the Luftwaffe could scarcely afford. Everything about the American machine spoke of logistics mastery, replaceable parts, mass production, and durability over delicacy. It was a machine born not from desperation, but from industrial supremacy. The more the Germans examined it, the more unsettling the realization became. The Thunderbolt was not an outlier, and it was a symbol, a representation of how far Allied industry, technology, and strategy had outpaced the Reich. And as those test flights began at Rechlin, that realization would no longer be theoretical. The engineers were about to experience what true power felt like in motion. When the Thunderbolt's engine first roared to life on German soil, its deep, mechanical thunder filled the airfield. Engineers covered their ears as the twin rows of cylinders came alive, spitting fire through exhaust stacks that trembled with restrained fury. It was not the sharp, crisp whine of a Daimler-Benz. It was something primal, raw, relentless. For the Luftwaffe test pilots, flying the captured Thunderbolt was like holding a mirror up to the Reich's own decline. Test reports from Rechlin described how the aircraft responded with monstrous strength, but required deliberate physical control. Its sheer stability in a dive astonished them, where German aircraft trembled and screamed past 450 miles per hour. The P-47 remained smooth, like a falling anvil slicing through air. Some pilots admired it quietly, others bitterly. In their logbooks, they wrote things the propaganda ministry would never print. The Americans do not build fighters for beauty. They build for victory. What shocked the engineers most was not a single innovation. It was the sum of everything. The Thunderbolt systems, engine, airframe, hydraulics, turbo ducts, and redundant electrical networks, all worked in harmony. There was no single miracle part. The miracle was the consistency. For a nation like Germany, now suffering fuel shortages, labor depletion, and fragmented production, the message was devastating. The Allies had reached a level of integration the Reich could no longer match, and they were doing it by the thousands. Each test flight reinforced the same bitter truth. The Americans could afford to build aircraft heavier, tougher, and more powerful because they had the fuel, factories, and resources to make it work. At Rechlin, one senior engineer was reported to have said quietly, "We could not build this, even if we understood it." The disassembly process became a ritual of disbelief. German technicians cataloged every wire, every bolt, every junction in the Thunderbolt's complex belly. The turbo-supercharger, a massive snail-shaped device buried in the rear fuselage, fascinated them most. They measured its heat-resistant alloys, inspected its automatic control valves, and noted the precision of its wastegate regulation system. It was, to them, a marvel of mechanical reliability. Germany had experimented with turbocharging before, particularly in high-altitude bombers, but the components had always been too delicate, too temperamental for combat use. The Thunderbolt system, by contrast, was simple to maintain and brutally effective. Then there was the radio equipment. The P-47's communications array allowed pilots to coordinate across vast distances with clarity that German radios could rarely achieve, especially in the later years of the war when materials and signal quality declined. Even the cockpit ergonomics impressed them. Controls were large and logically arranged, meant to be operated while wearing thick gloves in freezing altitudes. The oxygen system, electrical relays, and safety redundancies all hinted at a design philosophy built for long missions and hostile environments. German fighters, optimized for short, intense battles close to their bases, had no such endurance. When engineers traced the wiring diagrams, they realized something extraordinary. The Thunderbolt had been designed not just for pilots, but for mechanics. Components were accessible, standardized, and easily replaced. This meant the aircraft could be repaired and returned to service in hours, not days. The Luftwaffe's maintenance crews, on the other hand, were increasingly overworked and under-equipped, repairing aircraft in makeshift hangars by candlelight. The contrast cut deep. To the Germans, this wasn't merely engineering, it was industrial warfare perfected. The Thunderbolt forced the Luftwaffe's high command to confront a grim strategic truth. Germany could no longer win the air war through superior design alone. In early 1944, technical intelligence reports circulated between Oberst Peterson at Rechlin and the RLM, Reich Air Ministry. They concluded that Allied aircraft like the P-47 represented a new class of fighter, one that combined strategic range, altitude power, and survivability in ways the Luftwaffe could not counter effectively. Attempts were made to apply some lessons. The FD-190D9, with its longer fuselage and improved Jumo 213 engine, was partly inspired by the need to compete at high altitude. The Ta-152, a late-war derivative, incorporated heavier airframes and boosted power systems, perhaps echoes of what the Thunderbolt had demonstrated. But these efforts came too late. Production delays, shortages, and Allied bombing crippled Germany's capacity to innovate. In effect, the captured Thunderbolt became a silent teacher. It revealed to German engineers that their nation's engineering brilliance was being eclipsed not by superior minds, but by industrial strategy. They could not unlearn what they had seen. And in some private reports preserved after the war, German analysts wrote in tones of reluctant admiration, "This aircraft embodies a philosophy of war we cannot match, strength without compromise, mass without weakness. As the winter of 1944 turned into 1945, Friesland's airfields lay under the same Allied bombers the Thunderbolt had once protected. The engineers who studied it would soon see its descendants screaming through the sky again, this time not as a curiosity in a hangar, but as the executioner of the Reich's final defenses. The storm they had studied was now overhead. Winter, 1944. Snow blanketed the runways at Recklinlerz, muffling the sounds of a dying war. Fuel was scarce, and the once busy test fields were now eerily quiet. Only the occasional whine of a jet prototype or a captured Allied machine disturbed the silence. On one such morning, a squad of engineers and officers gathered by the hangar doors. Inside, the captured P-47 Thunderbolt, serial number partially obscured by soot, stood gleaming under pale light. Its silver skin was scarred by combat, its insignia repainted with black crosses. For the first time, a Luftwaffe test pilot was about to take it into the sky. His name was Hauptmann Hans Werner Lerche, one of the most skilled evaluation pilots in the Reich, known for flying nearly every Allied aircraft captured intact. Calm, methodical, and respected by engineers and commanders alike, he approached the Thunderbolt with a mix of professional curiosity and disbelief. Lerche climbed the ladder, settling into the cockpit. It was cavernous, far larger than the cramped confines of a Messerschmitt. He scanned the dials, manifold pressure, turbo regulator, mixture controls, magneto switches, all meticulously labeled in English. With assistance from engineers who had translated the manual, he began the startup sequence. The double Wasp engine coughed once, twice, then erupted to life, its 18 cylinders thundering in synchrony. The hangar shook. Even the German mechanics, hardened by years of aircraft noise, stepped back instinctively. As Lerche taxied to the runway, the aircraft felt heavy, sluggish, a beast that demanded respect. But once he advanced the throttle, the R-2800 came alive. The roar deepened and the Thunderbolt surged forward, snow swirling behind it in a blizzard of exhaust. Moments later, it was airborne. From the ground, the Germans watched as the massive fighter climbed steeply into the gray clouds, its silhouette unlike anything the Luftwaffe had built. For several minutes, the only sound was the distant rumble of its engine echoing across the frozen landscape. Lerche's flight notes, preserved after the war, reveal his astonishment. The acceleration is steady and immense. The aircraft feels unyielding, stable at every altitude. In a dive, there is no shudder, no vibration. Control surfaces remain firm and predictable. It does not fly. It plows through the air. At 25,000 feet, he engaged the turbo-supercharger. The effect was immediate. The engine regained full power, as if the altitude had vanished. No German fighter could do this without losing output. Lerche leveled out, accelerated past 440 miles per hour, and recorded, "This machine can fight at altitudes where our engines suffocate." When he landed 40 minutes later, the airfield crew gathered as he climbed down. His expression was calm, but his words, later relayed to the technical office, carried quiet weight. "It is not an elegant machine," he said, "but it is indestructible, a triumph of brute force over refinement." In his formal evaluation, Lerche praised its high-speed stability, diving capability, and the sheer power of its radial engine. He noted that it required strength to maneuver and was less agile than the FW-190, but its altitude performance, ruggedness, and firepower gave it decisive advantages. The engineers who reviewed his report were stunned. They had expected confirmation of inefficiency, that the Thunderbolt was simply an overweight anomaly. Instead, they were confronted with data proving that the Allies had achieved something far more dangerous: reliable power. That reliability was Germany's missing weapon. Every time the Reich built a machine, a tank, a plane, a rocket, it was a masterpiece. But masterpieces are fragile. They demand perfection in production, maintenance, and fuel. The Thunderbolt demanded none of that. It was a soldier's machine, built for war in the mud, not a showroom. In the weeks that followed, the Luftwaffe technical office compiled Lerche's data with reports from other pilots, who had observed or engaged Thunderbolts in combat. The findings were unanimous. Its dive speed exceeded any German fighter by at least 100 km/h. Its engine resilience allowed it to sustain damage that would destroy inline engines. Its armament could obliterate aircraft or ground targets with equal lethality. And its production scale meant the Allies could replace every loss in days. The verdict was sobering. No tactical advantage remains through pilot skill alone. The enemy's machine has surpassed our capacity to compensate. At Rechlin, the engineers sealed their findings into a classified report, Bewertung des erbeuteten P-47D, dated February 1944. It concluded simply, "This aircraft demonstrates a new doctrine of air superiority, technological abundance and mechanical dominance. What began as an engineering curiosity had become an existential revelation." And as the Thunderbolt continued to fill the skies above Europe, that revelation turned to dread. Spring, 1944. Over Europe, the air war had reached its crescendo. The once invincible Luftwaffe was now fighting a losing battle against endless waves of Allied bombers, flying fortresses and liberators, escorted by swarms of P-47 Thunderbolts. From the ground, German civilians stared upward at black dots scattered across the sky, their rumble echoing like distant thunder. For them, this sound no longer meant distant battles. It meant their own cities were burning. At Oschersleben, deep inside Germany, the Luftwaffe scrambled what was left of its elite units, JG-1, JG-11, and JG-300, to intercept the incoming formations. Among them, Oberleutnant Hans-Ulrich Uli Rudel, flying his worn-out Fu-190A8, led a desperate climb through flak bursts and contrails. Above 20,000 feet they found them, endless rows of silver bombers flanked by Thunderbolts. At first glance, the American escorts looked bulky and slow. But as Rudel dove toward them, the illusion shattered. The Thunderbolts didn't break formation. They dove to meet him. The first burst of .50 caliber fire ripped across his wing. The tracers came so fast, so dense, that the air itself seemed to ignite. Rudel rolled, dove, and pushed his throttle to the limit, but the Thunderbolt followed, steady, unshaken by the dive. He pulled out at 500 feet, his gauges screaming, his airframe shuddering under compressibility. The American behind him kept, firing until the last moment, then pulled up and effortlessly. Later, Rudel wrote in his logbook, "Our aircraft dives faster, but theirs dives longer. Where we fight the air, they master it." That single encounter repeated across Germany, hundreds of times. The P-47's dive advantage became its legend. German pilots learned to fear it not because of its speed and level flight. The FW-190 could still outturn and outroll it, but because of what happened when the Thunderbolt went nose down. At 400, then 450, then 500 miles per hour, German fighters would begin to shake and compress. Control surfaces would lock, elevators stiffen, wings tremble. But the Thunderbolt, with its thick wings and solid construction, would cut through the sound barrier's edge and still respond to the pilot's touch. Luftwaffe interceptors found themselves powerless. They could not chase it down and they could not escape its dives. Many German pilots began calling it the dive bomber hunter. Its nickname among Allied pilots was simpler, the Jug. To the men who flew it, it was both a tank and a sword, indestructible, unstoppable, and always bringing its pilots home. By the summer of 1944, its legend had spread across both sides of the front. Captured German reports, intercepted and translated by U.S. intelligence, revealed their grudging respect. The P-47, though heavy, possesses altitude superiority and indestructibility. It is not elegant, but it dominates the battlefield through endurance. Meanwhile, American pilots in the 56th Fighter Group, known as the Wolf Pack under Colonel Hub Zemke, proved the truth of those words every day. Their strategy was pure aggression. While the P-51 Mustangs would later take fame for escorting bombers deep into Germany, it was the P-47 units who broke the Luftwaffe's back. Flying from bases in England, Zemke's men perfected a terrifying tactic, the bounce. They'd approach from above, dive at incredible speeds, unleash short, brutal bursts from their 8 machine guns, and then climb back to altitude before the enemy could react. Every time they dove, another German squadron vanished. In one mission over Emden, the Wolfpack shot down 38 enemy aircraft for the loss of 2 Thunderbolts. Zemke's report was brief, almost cold. Enemy formation engaged. Superior diving speed achieved. Enemy aircraft disintegrated under gunfire. By mid-1944, Luftwaffe command was desperate. They had introduced the Bf-109G6 and FW-190D9, and even the first jets, the Me-262. But none could appear in numbers sufficient to change the tide. Fuel shortages, Allied bombing of synthetic plants, and constant attrition meant that Germany's air force was running on fumes. In contrast, Thunderbolts rolled out of American factories at a staggering pace, 5 every hour. Each one arrived fully armed, fueled, and ready to fly. For every German pilot who rose into the sky, there were 10 Thunderbolts waiting above the clouds, and their reach only grew. With external fuel tanks and upgraded P-47D and M variants, they could now escort bombers deep into Germany, all the way to Berlin. The very machine that German engineers had dismissed as too heavy for Europe was now over their own cities, raining destruction from above. At Rechlin, Hans-Werner Lerche watched these reports with grim understanding. The aircraft he had, tested months earlier, was now the instrument of Germany's ruin. He wrote one final note in his logbook before abandoning the airfield. The Thunderbolt is not the product of genius, but of industrial inevitability. It is the war machine that we feared we could never build, and they have built it by the tens of thousands. As the war entered its final act, one truth had become undeniable. Germany's age of technological superiority was over. The Allies had mastered not just invention, but production, power, and persistence. And nothing symbolized that shift more perfectly than the roar of a P-47 Thunderbolt streaking through the clouds, leaving the Reich's best fighters and its dreams far behind. By late 1944, the Allied air forces had gained total control of the skies. But the story of the Thunderbolt's dominance didn't end with the air war. It evolved, transforming the very concept of what a fighter could do. As historians later noted, the Thunderbolt was more than a fighter. It was a strategic instrument, shaping the air war and the outcome of the European conflict. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is a study in contrasts: brute power versus elegance, mass production versus artisanal craftsmanship, survivability versus fragility. It was not the fastest, nor the most agile fighter of World War II. Yet it became one of the most decisive machines of the air war, a weapon that symbolized the full scope of Allied strength. In dissecting the Thunderbolt, German engineers glimpsed the uncomfortable truth. Victory in modern warfare was no longer determined by individual brilliance alone, but by the integration of technology, industry, and strategy. The aircraft itself was only part of the equation. Behind it stood vast factories, abundant fuel, skilled labor, and a logistical network that could replace losses faster than any enemy could destroy them. For the men who flew it, the Thunderbolt was a guardian. Its rugged frame protected them from flak and bullets. Its raw power allowed them to dominate enemy fighters and destroy armored columns. Its presence inspired confidence on the ground. It was both shield and sword, a testament to the principle that a machine designed for endurance and adaptability could outmatch even the most finely tuned adversary. The captured P-47 at Rechlin became a silent witness to this reality. German engineers marveled at its design, acknowledging capabilities they could never replicate. They saw that the aircraft was more than a fighter. It was the embodiment of a new approach to war, one where industrial scale, mechanical reliability, and relentless power determined outcomes as much as tactics or valor. Ultimately, the Thunderbolt's legacy is not measured in kills or sorties alone. It is measured in the way it redefined air combat, forcing a reevaluation of what a fighter could be, and demonstrating that technological and industrial supremacy could tip the balance of war decisively. In the end, the roar of the P-47 over Europe was more than a sound. It was the echo of a turning point, A reminder that in war, as in history, power alone, when harnessed with vision and scale, can reshape the course of events, leaving an indelible mark on the battlefield and on memory itself.